You are summoned before dawn. The corridors of the royal palace are silent, save for the muffled echo of boots against cold marble. The air smells faintly of iron and incense. In the innermost chamber, beneath frescoes of saints and conquerors, the king lies dying, or so they say. But this is no visit for healing. You're not here to save a life. You're here to carry out a final order, one whispered through clenched teeth by a sovereign who has outlived his mind, but not his power. He wants silence, not just in voice, but in legacy. Behind a velvet curtain, a second chamber awaits. You step inside and freeze. Lined in rows like offerings are the bodies of men, dozens at first, then more, pale, intact, until your gaze drops lower, the same absence, again and again. The truth seeps in slowly. They were not soldiers. They were not traitors. They were his chosen, his servants, his shadows. 300 men, all cut into obedience. And now, in death, he wants their memory mutilated too. It began with a whisper, a rumor carried on the backs of servants too afraid to speak openly. The king no longer trusted the armed. He no longer feared the sword. What terrified him was desire. It was desire. He believed that cracked loyalty, lust that loosened tongues and opened paths to betrayal. In his mind, rebellion did not begin in battlefields, but in bedrooms. So he decided to destroy it at the root. The first order came quietly. 10 men, hand-picked from his private guard, summoned at midnight under the pretense of promotion. They were led into a chamber beneath the eastern wing, where doctors waited with silver tools, warm cloth, and unflinching expressions. No announcement, no trial, just a procedure. The next morning, those men returned to their posts, walking slower, speaking less, and when one collapsed from fever days later, he was buried without rites. But the king was not satisfied. One act of mutilation could be seen as necessity, a dozen, perhaps, as strategy. But 100, 300, that was no longer fear, it was conviction. He began choosing men not for strength, but for silence. Handsome scribes, young stewards, falconers with soft features, men who would never inherit titles, never lead troops, never threaten a lineage. He wanted loyalty that could not reproduce. He wanted servants who could not love. He wanted a court cleansed of flesh. The operation was clinical. A team of royal physicians, sworn to secrecy with their families' lives, performed the procedures with mechanical precision. They experimented with anesthetics, binding techniques, and recovery herbs to reduce mortality. Some begged, some went limp with shock, but none resisted after the door was locked. Outside, the court continued its masquerade. Harps played, banquets flowed, dancers spun across polished floors while beneath them. The king was sculpting obedience with a scalpel. Not even the queen was spared from the knowledge. She once entered the royal chapel and found a young tenor singing with a voice unnaturally high and perfect. The boy had once been her wine servant. Now he was a choir boy. Forever. The palace staff began to vanish in patterns. The footman who smiled too long. The stable boy with a lover's ring hidden beneath his collar. They disappeared without farewells, and returned, if at all, with eyes dull and voices hollow. But none dared question it aloud, because to speak it was to name the thing the king feared most. And in his court, nothing was more dangerous than truth whispered too clearly. Beneath the palace, past the kitchens and the wine cellars, behind a door that bore no seal and opened with no sound, lay the chamber where the truth was carved out of men. It was lit not by candlelight, but by oil lamps that burned with a steady, surgical glow. The walls were tiled in white, constantly scrubbed, but the smell could never be fully erased metal, sweat, crushed herbs, something older. The room had no name. In the records, It was listed as a storage annex, but among those who had seen its door, it was known as the Hollow, because no man came out whole. The table was made of iron, curved at the edges to collect what spilled. Beside it, a basin. Beside that, a cabinet with trays each lined with tools so finely crafted they could have come from a jeweler. Bone scissors, silk thread, cauterizing irons with handles of mother of pearl, all designed not to kill, but to preserve. The king demanded obedience, not martyrs. Each man was stripped, washed, and given a tincture that dulled the senses but did not silence them. They were kept awake not out of cruelty, but so the surgeons could monitor pulse, breath, and blood flow. Screams were muffled with cloth, movement restrained by leather. The procedure itself took less than 20 minutes. The healing, if it came, lasted a lifetime. No two victims were alike, but the end was the same. They were told they had been chosen, that it was a gift, that it proved their worth. And when they wept, they were told that pain was proof of purification. Some accepted it in dazed silence. Others cursed the crown until their throats gave out. One leapt from a parapet 2 nights after the surgery, leaving behind a blood trail that painted the marble like a wound the palace itself could not conceal. The royal physicians kept detailed records, hidden beneath false floors in their quarters, diagrams of altered anatomy, notes on tissue rejection, herbal recipes to reduce swelling. But what they could not record, what no ink could hold, was the look in a man's eyes when he woke to realize what had been taken. Not just his body, but his place in the world, his future, his claim to legacy. In time, they stopped resisting, not because they grew braver, but because they understood the futility. To refuse was to die. To comply was to disappear in a slower, quieter way. And above them, the king slept peacefully, believing, with each silent chamber filled, that his throne was safer, that desire had been banished from his court, that a man without the power to breed was a man without the power to betray. But beneath the stone, the silence was growing teeth. The king began to visit the chamber. Not often, only when the moon was thin, and the palace had quieted into the soft breathing of sleep, but enough that the surgeons began to keep a second set of linens, untouched by blood, reserved for his presence. He never touched the men, never spoke to them. He would stand behind the veil of gauze strung between the procedure and the observation alcove, his form a shadow in lamplight, motionless, breath held, watching. At first, the physicians believed he came to inspect their work, to ensure no corners were cut, no liberties taken, but it became clear with time that he was there not for quality, but for confirmation. He needed to see it, needed to look directly into the destruction he had ordered, not as horror, but as assurance. Proof that the court was being cleansed, that loyalty had a shape. And now, it had a sound, the soft rasp of silk thread through torn skin. One of the royal attendants, an aging steward who had served under the king's father, once caught sight of the sovereign leaving the hollow. The king's face was pale, not from disgust, but serenity, as if he had been to chapel, as if something unclean had been excised not from a man, but from the realm itself. His visits soon became ritual, always the same manner, cloaked, silent, unannounced. Sometimes he would murmur prayers, not to God, but to the concept of order. He called the silence that followed each surgery a benediction. The surgeons no longer flinched. They no longer wondered if this was madness. They simply bowed when he entered, and stitched while he watched. Meanwhile, his court shifted. The men nearest him, the scribes who copied his edicts, the guards outside his chamber, the musicians who played his meals, were all of the hollow. They wore no insignia, But the palace learned to recognize the signs: the high voice, the flat gaze, the absence of tension around the loins, and beneath their fine clothing, faint scars that crossed the lower belly like a seal of obedience. Foreign envoys took note. His Majesty surrounds himself with phantoms. One wrote, "Men who walk but do not speak, who smile but never desire." But they dared not ask. Spain had become a court of secrets, and at its center sat a man convinced that virility was treason and that a kingdom without heirs was a kingdom without rebellion. The queen, his second, younger than the first and quieter, once made the mistake of speaking against the practice. She questioned why the choirs grew smaller, why the palace nursery stood empty, why the servant boys no longer aged into fathers. The king did not reply, but within a week her chambermaid vanished, her confessor was reassigned. Her food began arriving late, and then, one evening, a lute player serenading the queen during supper struck a wrong note. A sharp discord. He was escorted from the room and never returned. The next day, a new player arrived. His face was smooth. His eyes did not rise to meet hers. And when he sang, his voice was perfect, high and trembling, like a songbird with no memory of sky. There had always been whispers about the king's body, rumors that trailed behind his coronation robes like a second train. The court physicians never spoke openly, but their silences were precise. Documents went missing. Exam records bore no signatures. The queen's first lady-in-waiting claimed he bled for days after certain rituals and wore bandages beneath his nightclothes long after any injury was expected to heal. The truth, they said, was not that he feared desire. It was that he could not feel it. His condition had a name one never uttered near the throne. A congenital defect, they murmured in the apothecary halls. A deformity severe enough to render intimacy painful, sometimes impossible. A body that resisted its own power. And in that resistance, shame bloomed. Not just shame of flesh, but shame of legacy, of being the last of a line destined to end not with a rebellion, but with a whimper. That shame did not make him humble. It made him ruthless. He began surrounding himself not just with eunuchs, but with men untouched by desire altogether. Boys taken from orphanages before puberty, trained to serve without ever tasting the hunger he so deeply loathed. Choirs made of treble voices, servants who had never held another's gaze too long, musicians who played with the passion of ghosts. The court became sterile, not just in flesh but in sound, in color, in breath. Laughter faded. Couples no longer danced. Even the palace gardens were trimmed to symmetry, their vines cut before they could curl. In private, the king grew more devout, not in faith, but in doctrine. He surrounded himself with theologians who interpreted scripture through the lens of control. He demanded exegesis that praised chastity as conquest, silence as virtue, sterility as sacred. He paid scribes to translate old monastic texts that claimed the highest purity came from bloodless obedience. He kept a book beside his bed, not the Bible, but a handmade tome bound in pale leather, filled with names, every man he had purified, each entry marked with a red wax seal. And yet, in moments of weakness, the mask cracked. Once, during a midnight storm, the queen heard him weeping behind the chapel doors. Not quietly, not in prayer, but in rage. The kind of weeping that had no object, just a wound that would not close. She did not speak of it. Not to her chambermaids. Not even to her confessor. Because in a palace where men were unmade, a tear could be as dangerous as a dagger. It was around this time that rumors began to spread beyond the palace walls. A butcher's son in Córdoba claimed his cousin had served the king, and returned home ruined. A sailor spoke of a nobleman's nephew who vanished after a royal appointment. These stories filtered through taverns and back alleys, always in whispers, always with the same dreadful refrain, "He takes their manhood," with his blessing, with his seal. And so the legend began to rot from the inside, not a king chosen by God, but one cursed in the flesh, not a father of a nation, but a maker of phantoms. And still, the hollow remained lit. Still, the oil lamps burned. Still, the names were written, because in the silence, the king heard safety. In their mutilation, he saw his own reflection broken, but obeyed. The queen's chambers became a prison of velvet and incense. She was not struck, not shouted at, not starved, but she was silenced. The women closest to her were gradually replaced by unfamiliar faces, silent maids with blank eyes and practiced curtsies. Her letters to her family in Naples were opened, read, and often rewritten before being sent. And when she spoke of loneliness, of the echoing halls and vanished voices, she was told to pray harder. At court, she still played her part. She smiled at ambassadors. She hosted feasts. She wore gowns stitched with gold thread that shimmered under candlelight. But her eyes no longer moved freely. They remained fixed just past the shoulder, never quite meeting the gaze of the men who bowed before her, because she could not be sure which of them had been hollowed. It was during a spring banquet that the truth finally broke through the facade. A young court singer, a boy no older than 17, collapsed during a solo. His voice cracked, blood spilled from his throat, and he clutched his side as he fell. Panic rippled through the hall. The queen rose to help, but the king did not move. He remained seated, watching as the guards surrounded the boy, lifted him without urgency, and carried him away through a hidden door behind the musician's alcove. That boy was never seen again. But a new singer took his place within days. He looked identical in age, posture, even tone, the same haunting, high voice, the same distant stare, and the queen understood then what could not be spoken. They were not chosen for talent. They were manufactured. Her own body had become a battlefield of expectation. The king had not touched her since the wedding night, yet still demanded signs of fertility. Midwives visited monthly to examine her. Royal physicians charted her cycles as if mapping weather. When she failed to conceive, blame was whispered not toward the king's history of barren marriages, but toward her womb, her prayers, her quiet, as if silence were a sin. She began to keep a journal, hidden in the base of a hollowed candelabrum. In it, she chronicled the disappearances, the falconer who never returned from a morning hunt, the page boy whose laughter stopped overnight, the violinist who dropped his bow mid-performance and vanished before the final toast. She listed their names, their voices, their last known smiles. It became her liturgy, a cathedral of memory for those unmade. Late at night, she would press her ear to the floor and listen, and sometimes, just beneath the stone, she swore she could hear them. Not screams, not moans, but a chorus of breath, steady, synchronized, waiting, as if the hollow had become something more than a chamber, as if it were a lung, breathing, learning, preparing. She told no one, because in a palace ruled by mutilation, hope was the most dangerous wound of all. One of them survived. His name was never written in the royal ledger. No wax seal marked his file. He was a clerical oversight, an orphan boy brought to the palace for menial service in the royal archives, meant to be processed like the rest, but spared by accident when a misfiled document recorded him as already altered, and so he remained intact, unchosen, unnoticed. For 2 years, He dusted manuscripts and carried scrolls through halls that smelled of old parchment and secrets. And in that silence, he listened. He began to chart the pattern who disappeared, and when. He noticed that the selection did not follow misconduct or disloyalty, but beauty, posture, voice. Those with delicate wrists or gentle eyes vanished fastest. Those who sang too well, who danced too gracefully, who drew too much gaze without asking for it. He saw the king only once, from behind a column in the library's upper alcove. The monarch walked slowly, gloved, accompanied by no one. He paused before a painting of Saint Sebastian, arrow-pierced, luminous, serene, and stared for nearly half an hour without blinking. That was when the boy began to write, not in the official ledgers, but in a stolen book bound in plain calfskin. Inside, he recorded the names of those taken, not just their names, but what they loved. Mateo, who carved ships from apple seeds. Andres, who wept at falcon births. Lucienne, whose lullabies made the hounds sleep. Details that would not survive elsewhere. Details too soft for a court obsessed with order. He called it the Book of the Unheard. And then he began to speak to the others. Carefully. In corners of the palace where the lamps burned low and guards passed rarely. In the laundry quarters, where the hollowed delivered linens without question. In the herb gardens, where silent gardeners snipped mint and basil without meeting eyes. He found those who could still write, those who still remembered who they were before the blade, and slowly, a network formed not of rebels, not yet, but of memory, of men who had been reshaped, but not erased. Some had sewn compartments into their robes to carry messages, others learned to sign with gestures, restoring language without sound. One, a former falconer, trained pigeons to carry notes beyond the palace walls. Another carved symbols into the undersides of chamber pots, where no one would dare to look. They passed stories like contraband. They remembered for each other. The queen never knew their names, but she felt their presence, a warmth in the way a goblet was placed on her tray, a fleeting glance from a boy sweeping ash, a folded paper pressed into her glove during morning mass blank to the eye, but faintly embossed with a circle split in 3. She knew it was not a threat. It was a promise. The hollow, once a tomb, had become a cradle, and something was beginning to stir. It began not with fire or steel, but with music. At a feast celebrating the king's 49th year on the throne, the grand hall was dressed in splendor. Chandeliers glowed with beeswax light. Walls shimmered with tapestries of conquest. Silver platters gleamed with roasted game and sugared fruits. The court gathered in silence, not from reverence, but fear, each toast measured, each compliment rehearsed. At the head of the table, the king sat motionless, his goblet untouched, his gaze fixed on nothing. Then came the musicians. They entered as they always did, young, identical in stature, trained to stillness, lutes, flutes, and viols held like extensions of their bodies. But the song they played was not one from the royal canon. It was unfamiliar, minor in key, slow in tempo. At first, no one reacted. Then the courtiers began to shift. Something about the melody was wrong, not dissonant, but too human, too sorrowful. It rippled with a mourning no one had permitted. The king's eyes narrowed. He raised a hand to stop the music, but the song did not end. The players continued, all of them, not with defiance in their faces, but with a deep and practiced calm. And behind them, from the side entrances, came more stewards, scribes, stable boys. Each held nothing but silence. They did not shout. They did not run. They simply stood, dozens of them lining the marble walls, filling the space between torches, their presence undeniable. Every one of them had been hollowed. The king stood, but his voice faltered. He demanded their names, but none answered. He called for guards, but none moved. The guards, too, had joined the line. The queen did not rise. She watched. From the center of the formation, one man stepped forward. He was unarmed. His face was plain, unmarked, unreadable. He knelt not in submission, but in witness. Then, slowly, he opened a scroll and read, no accusation, no call for justice, only names, one by one. In a voice high and strange, honed by mutilation but not silenced by it, he spoke the names of the taken, the forgotten, the reshaped. Each name a wound returned to the throne. By the time he reached the 100th, the room was silent not in fear, but in recognition. Then he stopped, folded the scroll, bowed once, and stepped back into the line. No swords were drawn that night, no blood spilled on the marble. But something had shifted. The king did not sleep. The next morning, his ministers found him pacing barefoot in the throne room, eyes bloodshot, muttering names none of them recognized. The hollow remained unchanged. But beneath its floor, the book of the unheard was growing thicker, and across the palace, the silence was no longer obedience. It was memory, and it was waiting. Years later, when the king was dead and his palace left to dust, a mason restoring the eastern wall uncovered a hollow space behind the stone. Inside it lay no treasure, no relic, only a book. Worn leather, no title, its pages filled with names, each one followed by a line of quiet script, what the man had loved, what had been taken, and what had endured. The court historians tried to dismiss it, an apocryphal ledger. They claimed the invention of a bitter servant or a failed poet. But the pages told a truth too precise to deny. Each name matched a face that had vanished from records. Each life bore the same shape of absence, no descendants, no graves, only faint echoes in the margins of archived orders and censored journals. They tried to seal the chamber again, tried to erase it from the architectural plans, to bury the silence as the king had once done. But the names had already spread, in whispered prayers, in lullabies sung by nursemaids who had never served a day in the palace, in the way boys looked at mirrors and wondered what it meant to be unmade for the comfort of power. The queen, long widowed, had fled south in the final year of his reign. She died in a convent overlooking the sea, her belongings few, a ring she never wore, a letter never sent, and a candle that burned until its base melted to wax. No one ever found her journal, but carved into the underside of her bed's wooden frame, hidden in the grain, were 13 circles split, marked, remembered. The hollow was never used again, but its walls still held breath, and sometimes, under the right light, those who passed through swore they could hear it, not screams, not weeping, but the steady sound of pages turning, a book that refused to close. And so the story endures not of a great king, nor of a noble court, but of a kingdom ruled by a man who feared the very thing he could not feel, and of those who lost everything, but remembered, not for vengeance, not for pity, but so no one would ever say again that they had been forgotten